Genesis chapter 6 might be the strangest and most debated chapter in the entire Old Testament. Giants, fallen angels, God regretting humanity, it has it all. So what does it really mean? Well, let's break it down. Genesis chapter 6 is often separated into two parts. The first part is titled Wickedness in the World, where the Bible continues telling the story of mankind's sin. After outlining the genealogical bloodline from Adam to Noah, Genesis 6 finally picks up where the story left off. Human beings are increasing in number and are rapidly populating the earth. Not only that, but we learn that the sons of God began to marry the daughters of men. Most translations will actually say the sons of God took wives from the daughters of men for themselves. So who were these sons of God exactly? More on that later, but we also learn that the sons of God and the daughters of men didn't just marry, but also had children referred to as the Nephilim. The author of Genesis explains that these Nephilim were heroes of old, men of renown. After looking at all of this, God then says that he will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. Some people interpret this as God declaring that mankind's lifespan is now shortened, but this was already mentioned in earlier chapters. It's more likely that this was God's way of announcing the impending judgment of the Great Flood, which happened 120 years after God made this declaration. Nonetheless, the Lord was contemplating how terrible the wickedness of the human race had spread throughout the earth. The Bible even says that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Wow, that's pretty intense, and it's probably unfathomable for us to even begin to comprehend today. We're pretty sinful by today's standards, but now try to imagine how much worse a primitive and tribal version of the entire human race was. Honestly, I'd rather not think about it. And if that wasn't shocking enough, the next thing we read is one of the most debated lines in the entire Bible. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. Wait, God regretted creating us? Well, not really. We'll get to that in a little bit too. Just be patient. After this, God makes his judgment very clear, saying that he plans to essentially wipe out the entire human race, with the exception of one guy and his family, Noah. And that takes us to the second part of Genesis chapter 6, Noah and the flood. Now, the second part of this chapter focuses more on the account of Noah and his family rather than the actual flood itself. The Bible describes Noah as a righteous man who was blameless among the people of his time. Noah must have been incredibly different from everyone else, considering that just a few verses before this, we learned that every bit of mankind was evil. He also had 3 sons named Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Then the Bible reminds us one more time that the earth was very corrupt and full of violence. God explains to Noah that he's going to destroy mankind, along with the entire earth, through a great and catastrophic flood. But he instructs Noah to build a gigantic ark so that he and his family are spared from this destruction. In fact, the Lord gives Noah very specific instructions on how to build the ark, from the supplies he needs to use, the dimensions, and even a few specs here and there. He also instructs Noah to bring 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive, and to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and stored away as food for Noah, his family, and the animals. And that's where the chapter ends. Okay, so it goes without saying that there is a lot to unpack here. Let me make it clear that Genesis chapter 6 is probably the most debated chapter in the entire Old Testament. Theologians and Christians don't agree on how to interpret a lot of this text, and it's easy to go down a rabbit hole with all of this information. I won't be able to cover everything in this video, but I do want to dive into 3 hotly debated topics that people still disagree on today, thousands of years after this chapter was written. So the first topic we'll cover is the identity of the sons of God. For thousands of years, religious scholars of all sorts have struggled to agree on exactly who the sons of God were. Were they angels, kings, or just the bloodline of Seth gone wrong? Well, that's where things get really interesting. There are 3 common views. The first and probably most popular view is that the sons of God were angels and or demons. In other words, this view holds that the sons of God were either fallen angels or demons who copulated with women. I know this sounds strange, but there are many reasons why people believe this. For starters, the phrase sons of God appears in the book of Job several times and always refers to demons. Also, the original Septuagint translated the phrase sons of God as angels. However, critics will argue that Jesus Christ makes it clear in Matthew 22:30 that angels don't marry nor are given in marriage. But counter-critics will say in response to that just because angels don't marry doesn't mean that they're sexless either. Nonetheless, there are still other theories about the identity of the sons of God that don't include fallen angels. For example, another theory is that the sons of God were simply human rulers or corrupt kings, very powerful men who forcibly took women in as their wives in a way that demonstrated their deep level of corruption and abuse of power. Remember, during this time, wickedness was at an all-time high, and every thought of the human heart was evil. It's possible that the sons of God were very powerful men who forced women to sleep with them, and because they were so powerful and authoritative, their offspring was uniquely revered, which would explain the Nephilim's heroes of old, men of renown description. But having said that, there is also a third theory that is very common in theological discussions, which is that these sons of God were the descendants of Seth, while the daughters of men were the descendants of Cain. Now, I don't want to reiterate everything I've said in previous videos, but remember that after the murder of Abel, there were two new bloodlines, one from Seth, who were described as righteous, and the other from Cain, who were sinful. This is another popular way to view the sons of God, which is that the righteous bloodline of Seth that was meant to inherit God's promises intermarried with the unrighteous women of Cain's bloodline. But if you need a refresher on this topic, then make sure to check out my previous videos on Genesis chapter 4 and 5 to understand what I'm talking about here. But regardless of what you believe, I want to make it clear that the purpose of this series is not to take a position on these theological debates. Instead, my goal is to present you with the different theological views surrounding the scriptures and to inspire you to continue reading and studying God's word on your own. So which of these three views do you find most convincing? Leave a comment down below and share your view with others. Now let's move on to the next commonly debated topic surrounding Genesis 6 that we'll cover in this video, which is the identity of the Nephilim. Now, I won't spend as much time on this one, especially since I'll eventually have to revisit the Nephilim again when we study other parts of the Old Testament. But nonetheless, this is where the Nephilim are first introduced in the Bible. Other parts of the Bible refer to the Nephilim as giants. Modern Bible scholars often struggle to interpret this. Were the Nephilim real, literal giants? Wouldn't we see some archaeological proof of that? Or were they mythological demigods, and maybe that's how we get tales of legendary people like Achilles and Hercules? Or maybe they were just legendary warriors who now have exaggerated descriptions of how powerful they were just because they were so feared during their lifetime. Regardless of what we think, one thing is for sure. The Nephilim were born as a result of the sons of God mating with the daughters of men. I guess the identity of the Nephilim sort of depends on the identity of the sons of God. Were they a completely different race, just a unique human tribe, or an entirely different species altogether? Comment your thoughts down below. And the final debated topic I'll cover in this video is answering the following question. Did the Lord really regret creating human beings? Critics of the Bible will often use Genesis chapter 6 through 7, as evidence that God is not all-knowing, and that he will change his plans depending on how they play out. Of course, one of the key attributes of God is his omniscience and absolute sovereignty. So is there a contradiction here? If God knows everything, then how could he regret doing something? Well, the key word to look at in this chapter is regret. The original Hebrew word used here is naham, which is better understood as to comfort oneself or to suffer grief. This is a really good example of anthropopathic language, or relational language, that the author purposely uses so the reader can relate to what was going on in the story. The word regret here is describing pain rather than a mistake. It's describing a holy grief experienced by the Lord. In Genesis 6, it's important to realize that God is genuinely grieved by human wickedness. It breaks God's heart, but it doesn't mean that his plan failed. You can think of it this way. When you know someone who has experienced a death in the family, a common thing to say is, "I'm sorry for your loss." In this case, when we say sorry, we're not saying that we're to blame for their death, but we do feel sorry. That's relational language. In a similar way, God is saying he was sorry he created human beings, not because he made a mistake, but because that word expressed the feeling of sorrow and grief he felt in that moment. But even then, this still begs an even more important question. If God already knows everything, and he knew that mankind would become so evil and wicked, then why did he create mankind to begin with? How does this align with God's sovereignty and foreknowledge? If God already knew all this, then why didn't he do anything to prevent it? Well, God is definitely omniscient, and he does know everything, so it's not that God changed his mind. In fact, if you start to believe that God will change his mind about his eternal plans, then this will lead you down the road towards something called open theism, which is something you definitely want to avoid since it discredits and outright denies many of God's attributes. So here's the thing. The reality is that God exists outside of time, but also clearly chooses to interact with us during time as we experience it. This is a bit complicated, but another way I can put it is that certain things may appear a certain way to us who exist during time, but are experienced completely different to God who experiences time all at once. So when God says that he feels sorry that he created mankind, he can say this as somebody who's experiencing grief with us in the moment, while also experiencing the victory when it all works out for good in the end, which is impossible for us to know until we get there. We see God feeling emotion with mankind in many places throughout the scriptures. In fact, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, has one of the most powerful messages, which is that the Lord experiences emotion alongside us. There are also places in the Old Testament where God expresses a deep love for Israel, and then others where he is extremely angry with them too. So even though God knows everything, it's important to remember that he experiences everything too. And when we read the scriptures, we are reading God's emotions in that point in time from our perspective. You see, one of the key lessons of this chapter is this. In Genesis chapter 6, God was not surprised by human sin. God wasn't admitting that he made a mistake, and he wasn't changing his mind either. The Lord was illustrating a profound truth, which is that God has such a deep love for mankind that even at our very worst, he's still willing to make a way for us to be redeemed. Romans 8:28 says, "In all things, God works for the good of those who love him." That means that even when the world looks too far gone, and even when you feel too far gone, God is still making a way for you. And by the Lord sparing Noah and his family, who loved God and lived a righteous life, God used the great flood and his divine judgment to turn evil into beauty, into something better. And God can do the same thing for you today. The Lord isn't done with you yet, and he wasn't done with mankind yet either. In fact, there's a whole new and exciting part of this story coming up in Genesis chapter 7. So consider subscribing to this channel, stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one. God bless.